Racist cop harasses black woman at a bar. Seconds later, her rank is revealed. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. On a quiet Friday night, Danielle Brooks sat alone at the corner of a neighborhood bar just off Main Street, a place locals favored for its soft music and steady conversation rather than noise or spectacle. She had chosen the stool with a clear view of the room, not out of habit, but out of comfort, the kind that comes from awareness rather than caution. Danielle carried herself with calm confidence, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, her posture relaxed, her hands resting around a glass of iced water as she listened to the low murmur of voices blending with the hum of ceiling fans above. The bartender, Mike Carter, nodded politely as he passed, already recognizing the quiet assurance in her presence, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally earned respect. Across the room, laughter rose and fell. Chairs scraped lightly against the wooden floor, and for a moment the night felt unremarkable, ordinary, even peaceful. That changed when Officer Ryan Walker stepped through the door. Walker wore his uniform like armor, his badge catching the warm bar lights as he scanned the room with practiced authority. He was off duty, but the confidence of his position followed him everywhere, shaping the way he walked, the way he stood, the way he looked at people, as if he were always measuring where they belonged. His eyes lingered on Danielle longer than necessary, his expression tightening not with concern, but assumption. He took a slow step forward, then another, until his shadow fell across her seat. Danielle noticed him immediately, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because she understood the weight of presence and how quickly it could shift a room. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze without challenge, without fear, simply acknowledging him as one human being acknowledges another. Walker cleared his throat and spoke with a tone that suggested familiarity where none existed, asking questions that weren't requests and making comments that carried an edge of judgment disguised as authority. Around them, conversations softened, curious glances flickered, and the bar's easy rhythm faltered just enough to be felt. Danielle remained composed, her voice steady when she responded, offering brief, polite answers, never escalating, never shrinking. To the casual observer, she looked like a woman enduring an inconvenience, but beneath that stillness was intention. She was listening, assessing, choosing patience over reaction. Walker mistook her calm for compliance, mistook her silence for submission, and continued, unaware that every word he spoke revealed more about himself than about her. The bartender hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, while a couple nearby exchanged uneasy looks, sensing the imbalance but unsure how to name it. Danielle shifted her glass slightly, the ice clinking softly, and for a brief second her eyes drifted toward the door, not in search of escape, but as if confirming something already set in motion. What Walker could not see was the depth behind her restraint, the reason she did not raise her voice, the authority she did not yet reveal. To him, she was just another face in a bar, another moment to assert control, another chance to feel powerful. To the room, she was quiet. To the truth waiting just ahead, she was exactly where she needed to be. The bar settled into an uneasy stillness as Officer Ryan Walker continued to hover near Danielle Brooks, his presence filling more space than his body alone should have allowed. He leaned slightly against the counter, close enough to be intrusive, his voice carrying the subtle tone of authority he was accustomed to using without question. He commented on her being there alone, on the time of night, on how he was just making sure everything stayed orderly, each sentence framed as casual conversation but weighted with judgment. Danielle listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, her breathing slow and steady, as though she were absorbing the rhythm of the room rather than the words directed at her. She had learned long ago that patience was not weakness but control, and in moments like this, control mattered more than anything else. Around them, the bar's atmosphere shifted further, the hum of conversation thinning as patrons became more aware that something uncomfortable was unfolding, something familiar yet rarely addressed. Mike Carter wiped down the counter with deliberate slowness, his eyes flicking between Walker and Danielle, sensing that this was not a simple misunderstanding but uncertain how to step in without escalating the situation. Walker straightened his posture and adjusted his belt, the badge at his waist catching the light again as if to remind everyone who he believed he was in charge. He asked where Danielle was from, whether she lived nearby, questions that sounded routine but carried no real purpose beyond asserting dominance. Danielle answered calmly, offering minimal information, her tone respectful yet firm, making it clear she had nothing to hide and no reason to justify her presence. Her composure seemed to irritate Walker more than defiance would have, and he pressed on, remarking on how people should know better than to give him attitude, even when none had been shown. A couple seated near the window exchanged a glance, the woman shifting uncomfortably in her chair while her companion lowered his eyes, unwilling to draw attention. Danielle noticed these small reactions, the way silence spread when no one spoke up, and she understood how quickly isolation could form in moments like this. Still, she did not raise her voice or challenge him outright. Instead, she reached slowly into her jacket pocket, not in haste, not defensively, but with measured intention, pausing just long enough for Walker to notice and stiffen slightly. She withdrew her phone and placed it face down on the counter, a simple gesture that signaled preparedness rather than threat. Walker scoffed lightly, making a remark about people always thinking they could record their way out of trouble, his tone dismissive as he waved a hand. Danielle met his eyes again, her gaze unwavering, and said quietly that she was simply waiting for someone, her words carefully chosen, her meaning layered. The officer laughed under his breath, assuming she meant a friend or a ride, someone inconsequential, someone who would arrive too late to matter. He stepped back half an inch, satisfied that he had reasserted control, unaware that his assumptions were stacking up against him. The clock above the bar ticked forward, seconds passing with quiet significance, and outside, headlights swept briefly across the front windows as a vehicle slowed, then stopped. Danielle glanced toward the door again, this time with purpose, and Walker followed her, gaze curiosity replacing his smug confidence for the first time that night. The room seemed to hold its breath as footsteps approached, and in that moment, before a single word was spoken, the balance of power began to shift in ways Walker could not yet comprehend. The door opened quietly, but the shift in the room was immediate, like a subtle change in air pressure that everyone felt before they understood why. A tall man stepped inside, his presence calm but unmistakably purposeful, dressed in a dark jacket that carried no insignia yet conveyed authority through posture alone. Captain Jonathan Reed paused just long enough to scan the room, his eyes moving with precision rather than curiosity, before settling on Danielle Brooks at the bar. Danielle did not wave or call out. She simply met his gaze and gave the smallest nod, a gesture so restrained that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained to see it. Reed walked forward at an unhurried pace, his shoes striking the wooden floor with soft, even steps, stopping a few feet behind Officer Ryan Walker. Walker sensed someone close and turned slightly, annoyance flickering across his face as he prepared to assert himself yet again. He did not recognize Reed at first, and that uncertainty irritated him. Reed spoke calmly, his voice steady and low, asking if everything was all right. Walker responded with forced confidence, explaining that he was handling a routine situation, that he was just keeping the peace, the familiar language of justification rolling easily off his tongue. Reed listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his hands relaxed at his sides, allowing Walker to finish every word. When Walker finally paused, Reed glanced toward Danielle, then back to Walker, and asked her name aloud, pronouncing it carefully, respectfully. Danielle answered evenly, her voice clear but unraised, and for the first time since Walker had entered the bar, There was no edge in the exchange, only clarity. Reed nodded once, then reached into his jacket and removed a slim leather holder, opening it just enough for Walker to see the identification inside. The change was immediate and visible. Walker's posture stiffened, his shoulders drawing back as recognition set in, the color draining slightly from his face as he processed what he was seeing. Reed introduced himself fully, his title stated plainly, without emphasis, without pride, simply as fact. He explained that Danielle Brooks was not just someone waiting for a friend, not just another patron minding her own business, but someone whose rank placed her well beyond the casual authority Walker had assumed over her. The bar fell silent, not out of fear, but out of collective realization, the kind that settles heavily when assumptions collapse. Mike Carter stopped wiping the counter, his cloth frozen mid-motion, while nearby patrons straightened in their seats, suddenly aware that they had just witnessed a moment that would not be forgotten. Walker attempted to speak, to recover, to reshape the situation with words, but his confidence no longer had weight. Reed did not raise his voice or issue threats. He simply asked Walker to step aside and reminded him that professionalism did not depend on who was watching, but on how one chose to act when no one appeared to matter. Danielle remained seated, composed as ever, observing quietly as the dynamic reversed itself without spectacle. She did not gloat or comment. Her silence carried more authority than any reprimand could have. Reed thanked the bartender for his patience, acknowledged the patrons with a brief glance, and turned back to Danielle, asking if she was ready to go. She stood calmly, smoothing her jacket, her movements unhurried, and for the first time that night, Walker looked at her not through the lens of assumption, but through the clarity of truth. As Danielle and Reed walked toward the door, the room slowly exhaled, conversations resuming in hushed tones, each person aware that they had just seen how quietly power could reveal itself and how easily it could be misjudged. Outside the bar, the night air felt cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier that evening as Danielle Brooks and Captain Jonathan Reed paused beneath the soft glow of a streetlight. Traffic moved steadily along Main Street, headlights passing like quiet witnesses to what had just occurred. Reed opened the passenger door of his vehicle, but did not rush her, allowing Danielle a moment to breathe, to settle the weight of the encounter without spectacle. Inside the bar, Officer Ryan Walker remained frozen near the counter, the sound of laughter and music returning slowly around him as if the room itself were trying to forget his presence. For Walker, however, the moment refused to fade. He replayed every word, every assumption, every misplaced confidence, realizing too late how easily authority could turn into exposure. Reed spoke calmly once Danielle was seated, remarking on how situations like these often unfolded not because of chaos, but because of routine, because people relied too heavily on habits they never questioned. Danielle listened, her gaze focused ahead through the windshield, the street stretching out before them like a long, quiet reflection. She had encountered moments like this before, moments when restraint mattered more than reaction, when silence revealed more than argument ever could. Reed started the engine, and as they pulled away from the curb, the bar receded into the distance, its lights shrinking until it became just another building among many. Inside the vehicle, the radio remained off, the silence comfortable, intentional. Danielle finally spoke, not to recount what had happened, but to acknowledge the larger pattern behind it, the way certain spaces still demanded proof of belonging from some and granted it freely to others. Reed nodded, understanding without needing elaboration, reminding her that documentation would follow, that professionalism required accountability even when correction felt uncomfortable. Meanwhile, inside the bar, patrons continued their conversations in hushed tones, some glancing toward the door Danielle had exited through, others shaking their heads quietly as if reconsidering assumptions of their own. Mike Carter poured another round of drinks, his movements steady, but his thoughts lingered on the quiet strength he had witnessed, the way composure had shifted power without raising a voice. Walker eventually stepped outside alone, the night greeting him without judgment, yet heavier than before. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting his jacket, staring at the pavement as realization settled in fully. There had been no argument, no confrontation, no scene he could dismiss as misunderstanding. There had only been his words, his tone, and the clarity of what they revealed. Across town, Danielle and Reed drove on, the city lights reflecting off the windshield as Reed spoke briefly about next steps, about ensuring the encounter was recorded accurately, not to punish, but to correct, to prevent repetition. Danielle appreciated the distinction, knowing that real change came not from anger, but from systems forced to look at themselves honestly. She leaned back in her seat, the tension finally easing, aware that while the night had begun as an ordinary pause in a familiar routine, it had ended with something exposed that could not be ignored. The city continued to move around them, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place, unaware that in one small bar on Main Street, authority had been tested and truth had quietly taken its place. The following morning unfolded with deliberate quiet as Danielle Brooks sat in a modest office overlooking the city, sunlight filtering through half-drawn blinds and casting soft lines across a desk neatly arranged with folders and a closed laptop. The night before had already been documented in her mind, not as an emotional encounter, but as a sequence of decisions and observations that mattered because of what they represented, not because of how they felt. She reviewed the timeline carefully, recalling Officer Ryan Walker's tone, his assumptions, the precise moment when authority had shifted without confrontation. Across from her, Captain Jonathan Reed stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching traffic move below like a steady current that never stopped for individual moments of reckoning. Reed spoke calmly, confirming that a formal review would proceed as standard protocol, emphasizing that accountability was not punishment but correction, a necessary recalibration within a system that relied too heavily on unchecked routine. Danielle nodded, fully aware that moments like the one at the bar rarely stood alone, that they echoed patterns seen countless times before, often unchallenged simply because no one with recognized standing had been present. Meanwhile, across town at the precinct, Walker arrived earlier than he ever had before, his uniform pressed with unusual care as if precision might undo what had already been revealed. The familiar hum of the station felt different that morning, quieter, heavier, each interaction carrying a subtle edge of awareness. He avoided eye contact with colleagues, sensing that word had traveled faster than he expected, not as gossip, but as quiet acknowledgement. He sat at his desk staring at the incident report prompt on his computer screen, the cursor blinking patiently, waiting for him to describe events stripped of assumption and ego. For the first time, he struggled to frame himself as the authority in the narrative. Across the city, Danielle moved through her day without haste, attending meetings, reviewing reports, her presence commanding respect not through insistence, but through consistency. Those who worked with her noticed nothing unusual, yet beneath the routine, the implications of the previous night settled into place. She understood that change rarely arrived loudly, that it often began with discomfort and reflection rather than confrontation. Reed later joined her for a brief discussion, confirming that the review process would include training reinforcement, oversight, and formal acknowledgement of the misjudgment that had occurred. Danielle appreciated the clarity, the refusal to dramatize what did not need spectacle. That afternoon, Walker was called into a small conference room, the walls bare, the lighting even, the environment designed to remove distraction. A supervisor spoke evenly, outlining concerns not as accusations, but as facts, referencing conduct, tone, and assumption. Walker listened, his earlier defensiveness replaced by an unfamiliar awareness, realizing that his authority had never been questioned because he had rarely been challenged. He left the room without argument, carrying with him the understanding that silence from others had never meant approval. As evening approached, Danielle stepped outside the building, the city air warm against her skin, watching as lights flickered on one by one across downtown. She reflected not on vindication, but on responsibility, on the quiet burden of knowing that her rank could open doors that remained closed to others without it. She hoped the moment at the bar would linger not as a story of embarrassment, but as a lesson carried forward in subtler ways. Somewhere across the city, Walker drove home in silence, the radio off, the road stretching ahead of him like an unspoken question. He knew the night had changed something, not through force or spectacle, but through clarity. And in that shared city, moving steadily toward another ordinary night, both understood that authority revealed without humility always found itself exposed by truth. Days passed, and the city settled back into its familiar rhythm. But beneath the surface, subtle shifts continued to unfold as Danielle Brooks moved through her responsibilities with the same measured composure that defined her presence. Meetings came and went, reports were reviewed, and decisions were made with quiet precision, each action reinforcing the standard she expected from herself and from the system she served. She understood that leadership was not proven in moments of recognition, but in consistency when attention faded. Across the department, training schedules were adjusted, language was reviewed, and conversations began that rarely happened without a catalyst. None of it carried her name publicly, yet her influence threaded through every discussion. Captain Jonathan Reed checked in periodically, not with urgency, but with respect, ensuring that procedures remained intact and that the lessons from the incident were integrated rather than forgotten. Danielle appreciated the restraint, knowing that true accountability did not require public display. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Walker found himself navigating a different reality, one shaped less by punishment and more by awareness. Assigned to routine duties, he noticed how differently he moved through spaces now, how conscious he had become of his tone, his posture, the assumptions that once went unquestioned. Conversations with colleagues felt more deliberate, pauses longer, words chosen with care. Some offered quiet support, others distance, but none treated him the same as before, and he could not blame them. The incident had stripped away the illusion that authority alone commanded respect. One afternoon, Walker attended a mandatory training session in a plane room with rows of chairs and a single screen at the front. The facilitator spoke about perception, about how power could distort judgment when unchecked. Walker listened without defensiveness, recognizing moments that mirrored his own behavior, moments he once would have dismissed. For the first time, reflection replaced justification. Across town, Danielle visited the same neighborhood where the bar stood, not to revisit the incident, but to attend a community meeting focused on trust and transparency. She entered without announcement, taking a seat among residents, listening more than she spoke. When questions arose about fairness and accountability, she responded calmly, emphasizing structure, responsibility, and the importance of dignity in every interaction. Her words were not promises of perfection, but commitments to process, and that honesty resonated more deeply than grand assurances ever could. As the meeting ended, a few attendees thanked her quietly, not for her rank, but for her presence. That evening, Walker drove past the bar on his way home, the lights glowing warmly against the darkening sky. He did not stop, but the memories surfaced nonetheless, not with resentment, but with clarity. He understood now that the moment had not been about losing authority, but about confronting the gap between what authority should be and what he had allowed it to become. Somewhere else in the city, Danielle reviewed final notes from the day, closing her laptop as the clock ticked toward night. She felt no triumph, only resolve, knowing that moments like these mattered precisely because they were quiet, because they reshaped behavior without spectacle. The city outside her window moved steadily, unaware of the individual reflections taking place within its boundaries. Yet in those unseen spaces, something fundamental had shifted. Assumptions had been challenged, habits examined, and understanding deepened, not through force, but through exposure to truth. And as another ordinary night settled over the streets, both Danielle and Walker carried forward lessons that would continue to echo long after the moment that first brought them together had faded from memory. The shift became unmistakable during a departmental briefing held 1 week later, a routine gathering that usually passed without reflection, but this time carried a quiet gravity as Danielle Brooks entered the room alongside Captain Jonathan Reed. Conversations softened as heads turned, not out of surprise, but recognition. Danielle took a seat near the front, her demeanor unchanged, composed, attentive, allowing the moment to unfold without announcement. Reed addressed the group calmly, speaking about standards, about responsibility, about how authority was defined not by position alone, but by conduct when no one expected oversight. He referenced recent events without naming locations or dramatizing outcomes, focusing instead on lessons learned and expectations moving forward. As he spoke, Danielle observed the room, noting subtle reactions, a straightening of posture here, a thoughtful pause there, signs that the message was landing where it mattered. Officer Ryan Walker sat several rows back, listening with focused attention, aware that this moment represented more than procedure. When Reed concluded, he invited Danielle to speak, not as a reprimand, but as a voice of perspective. Danielle stood slowly, her presence steady, and spoke in measured tones about dignity, about how respect should never need to be demanded, only demonstrated. She did not recount the bar or the confrontation. Instead, she spoke about trust, about how easily it could be weakened and how deliberately it must be rebuilt. Her words carried weight precisely because they lacked accusation. The room remained silent, engaged, each listener processing their own assumptions. Walker felt the impact sharply, not as shame, but as clarity, recognizing how her restraint had forced reflection where defensiveness would have failed. After the meeting, small conversations formed in the hallway, quieter than usual, more thoughtful. Danielle exchanged brief nods with several officers, acknowledging professionalism where she saw it, reinforcing accountability through presence alone. Reed walked with her toward the exit, remarking that moments like this rarely made headlines, yet shaped culture far more effectively. Outside, the building stood, unchanged, brick and glass reflecting the afternoon sun, unaware of the recalibration taking place within. Across the city, news of internal reviews and updated training circulated quietly, not as scandal, but as progress, signaling that systems could respond without spectacle. Walker returned to his duties later that day, moving through familiar spaces with renewed awareness, greeting people with intention, listening more than he spoke. The difference was subtle but real, noticed by colleagues and community members alike. That evening, Danielle walked through a downtown park, the air warm, families gathered near fountains, children laughing as they chased one another across open grass. She paused briefly, watching the scene, reminded of why standards mattered beyond institutions, because everyday moments deserved safety and respect without condition. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the path, she continued on, her steps unhurried, her purpose steady. In a city that rarely stopped long enough to notice change, something had shifted, not loudly, not forcefully, but with intention. Authority had been examined, humility had been modeled, and truth had revealed itself without demand. For those who witnessed it, the lesson remained clear long after the moment passed, that real power did not announce itself, and real justice often arrived quietly, leaving understanding in its wake. The weeks that followed carried a quiet sense of resolution as the city continued forward, shaped subtly by changes few could pinpoint, but many could feel. Danielle Brooks remained focused on her work, reviewing policies, mentoring younger officers, and reinforcing expectations through example rather than command. Her presence became a steady reference point, a reminder that authority carried responsibility beyond visibility. Captain Jonathan Reed ensured that the adjustments initiated after the incident were not treated as temporary responses, but woven in a long-term practice, emphasizing consistency over reaction. The department began to reflect that shift, not through announcements, but through behavior, measured language, and a renewed awareness of how easily trust could be tested. Officer Ryan Walker experienced the clearest consequence of that change not through discipline, but through reflection. He noticed how interactions unfolded differently now, how people responded when he approached with openness rather than assumption. The difference was subtle yet unmistakable, and it forced him to confront how much of his former confidence had relied on unchecked habit rather than intention. One afternoon, Walker found himself assigned to a community outreach event at a local recreation center, a role he once would have dismissed as secondary. This time, he approached it with care, listening more than speaking, answering questions plainly, aware that credibility was earned moment by moment. The conversations were simple, yet meaningful, and for the first time, he understood how presence without judgment could change perception. Across town, Danielle attended a review session with senior leadership, discussing broader implications of recent events. She spoke candidly about systems, about how accountability required more than correction. It required willingness to examine discomfort honestly. Her words were met with thoughtful silence rather than resistance, an outcome she valued more than agreement. Outside the formal setting, life continued at its familiar pace. The bar on Main Street remained open, its regular patrons unaware of the role it had played in a quiet recalibration of authority. Mike Carter continued his work behind the counter, occasionally recalling the night when silence had carried more weight than confrontation, sharing the lesson with no one, yet holding it close. For Danielle, the incident faded into memory not as a personal victory, but as confirmation that patience and clarity could redirect moments that once ended poorly. She understood that progress rarely came as a single turning point, but as accumulation, each choice reinforcing the next. Walker, too, recognized that the encounter had marked a dividing line, not between blame and forgiveness, but between who he had been and who he chose to become. The city itself offered no acknowledgement, its streets busy, its lights steady, its routines uninterrupted. Yet beneath that surface, relationships shifted, expectations recalibrated, and understanding deepened. Danielle walked through her days with the same composed stride, her rank known but rarely invoked, her influence felt rather than stated. Walker moved forward with greater humility, aware that authority was not diminished by reflection, but strengthened by it. In quiet offices, training rooms, and everyday interactions, the lesson endured that justice did not always arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it arrived in the form of awareness, leaving those it touched changed in ways that only time would fully reveal. And as the city continued onward, it carried with it a quieter, steadier understanding of what respect required and what truth, once revealed, could set in motion without ever raising its voice. The story settled into its final quiet chapter on an ordinary evening, the kind that rarely drew attention yet, carried the weight of everything that came before. Danielle Brooks walked along the same downtown streets she had traveled countless times, the city lights reflecting softly off storefront windows as people moved past one another without pause. To them, she was simply another woman heading home, unremarkable in the way true influence often was. She welcomed that anonymity, knowing that the power she carried did not need to be seen to be effective. In her work, the changes she had helped set in motion continued steadily, reflected in policies clarified, conversations reshaped, and expectations reinforced without fanfare. She understood that justice was not a moment to be celebrated, but a standard to be upheld daily, especially when no one was watching. Across the city, Officer Ryan Walker prepared for another shift, his routine familiar, yet his perspective transformed. He approached his duties now with deliberate awareness, mindful of the responsibility that came with every interaction. The memory of the bar no longer stung, but instructed, reminding him that authority without humility inevitably exposed itself. He had learned that respect was not automatic, but earned through conduct, consistency, and restraint. His colleagues noticed the change, not through declarations, but through tone, patience, and the absence of assumption. Captain Jonathan Reed reviewed reports late into the evening, satisfied not with outcomes, but with process, knowing that systems only improved when individuals chose reflection over defensiveness. The city itself offered no acknowledgement of these internal shifts, continuing its rhythm uninterrupted, traffic flowing, lights glowing, routines repeating. Yet within that continuity, something meaningful had taken root. The bar on Main Street remained just another place where people gathered to unwind, unaware that it had once been the setting for a quiet lesson in power and truth. Mike Carter closed up for the night, locking the door as he always did, carrying with him a memory of how silence and dignity had reshaped a moment without raising a voice. Danielle paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change, watching as strangers stood beside her, each carrying their own stories, their own assumptions, their own unseen burdens. She knew that not everyone would be afforded the patience she had exercised, and that truth weighed heavily on her sense of responsibility. It reinforced why she chose restraint, why she allowed systems to reveal themselves rather than forcing confrontation. Across town, Walker drove through familiar neighborhoods, the radio low, the road stretching ahead as a reminder that growth was not an event but a path. He no longer sought validation through control, understanding instead that real authority was measured by how little it needed to assert itself. As the night deepened, the city exhaled into quiet, unaware that within its boundaries, understanding had shifted in ways that statistics could never capture. Danielle reached her door and paused, reflecting briefly not on vindication, but on balance, on how truth had arrived without spectacle and left clarity in its wake. She knew that moments like the one at the bar would continue to happen elsewhere, to others, in different forms. What mattered was how they were met, how dignity was preserved, and how truth, when revealed, recalibrated power without force. In the end, no headlines marked the change, no applause followed the lesson. There was only the quiet echo of understanding, the kind that lingered long after words faded. He believed the badge made him untouchable, but that night proved something else entirely, that authority without humility always answers to truth, and truth, once revealed, outranks everything else.